Margaret, a 75-year-old widow, lived alone in a modest house in the small town of Seabrook. Her mornings always began the same way. She woke up to the sound of birds, made herself a cup of tea, and sat on the porch to watch the peaceful neighborhood go about its day. Her routine was a sanctuary of tranquility after decades of life's ups and downs. One sunny afternoon, while tending to her garden, Margaret noticed the mailman approaching. He handed her a letter with a gentle smile. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Margaret. Looks like you've got something special today." Margaret's heart quickened. It was rare to receive letters. Back inside, Margaret examined the letter. The envelope was plain, but the fresh postmark indicated it had been sent from far away. With trembling hands, she opened it. The letter began in a familiar but nearly forgotten handwriting. "Dear Margaret, if this letter reaches you, it means I finally made it. I need to see you before it's too late." Margaret felt the air leave her lungs. She read and reread the words in disbelief. Jack, her great love, who she had believed died in the war, was alive. Her hands shook as she held the letter, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. Sitting in the living room armchair, Margaret let her mind wander back to the past. Memories of Jack were vivid, the way he smiled, the way he held her hand, the promises of a future together. "How is this possible?" she whispered to herself, lost in thought. The letter didn't offer many details, just an address and a desperate request for her to visit. "I can't believe he's alive," Margaret murmured, still in shock. "But if he is, I have to see him." That night, Margaret had trouble sleeping. Anxiety and excitement swirled in her mind. "Jack, I never forgot you," she thought, before finally drifting off, clutching an old photo of the two of them together. The next morning, during breakfast, she decided to tell her children. When they were all gathered, she said, "I received a letter yesterday." Her children looked curious. "It's from Jack. He's alive." There was a stunned silence before the flood of questions began. "Mom, that can't be true. It must be some kind of mistake," her eldest son David said, trying to be rational. "We all believed he died in the war." "I thought so too, but the handwriting is his. And I need to find out the truth," Margaret replied, her voice firm but full of emotion. "We just want you to be safe, Mom." "What if it's some kind of scam?" suggested Sarah, her youngest daughter, worried. "We love you and want the best for you." Margaret looked at her children, understanding their concerns but feeling the urgency in her heart. "I understand, my dears, but this is a chance I can't let slip away. If there's even the slightest possibility that Jack is alive, I need to see him." Stunned by the discovery, Margaret spent the next few days on an emotional roller coaster. Between the anger over lost years, the hope of reuniting with her love, and the regret for the decisions made, she felt overwhelmed. On a rainy afternoon, she sat in her favorite armchair and reminisced about the happy moments with Jack before the war. The memories came in waves. Their first meeting at the corner cafe, the long walks on the beach at sunset, and the shared dreams of a future together. "We were so young and full of hope," Margaret thought, holding a photo yellowed with age. "How can life be so cruel?" Jack's letter revealed that he had hired a detective many years ago to find her. "Dear Margaret," he wrote, "I never gave up searching for you. Every day that passed, the hope of finding you kept me alive." Margaret decided that she needed to find Jack, even if it meant facing her children's disapproval. "Mom, you can't just leave and travel like this," David said, his concern evident. "You don't understand," Margaret replied with determination. "I have to do this. Jack is out there, waiting for me." Her children were understandably worried about their mother's health and safety. "What if you get hurt? What if it's not him? Have you thought about that?" Sarah argued, trying to appeal to reason. "Yes, I've thought of all that, but this is a chance I can't ignore. I've lived too many years with regrets. I don't want to add another one to the list," Margaret responded, her voice soft but firm. Margaret's words brought a reflective silence. Her children, though reluctant, began to understand the depth of what this reunion meant to her. "If this is what you really want, we'll be here for you, Mom," David finally said, his voice full of emotion. Margaret smiled, feeling grateful for the reluctant but sincere support of her children. She knew the journey would be challenging, but her heart was set. "Thank you, my dears. I promise I'll be careful." She spent the following days organizing her things and preparing for the trip. With each step, the image of Jack became clearer in her mind, and the hope of seeing him again filled her with energy. "I'm coming, Jack. Wait for me," Margaret thought as she packed her suitcase. The preparations for the trip were more challenging than Margaret had imagined. She found herself struggling with logistics and emotions. Every item she placed in the suitcase brought a wave of memories and feelings. "How many years has it been since I took a trip like this?" she wondered, carefully folding a blouse. She decided to write a farewell letter to her children, explaining her decision and asking them to take care of each other. "Dear ones, I know you're worried, but I need to do this. Find joy in your lives, and don't let fear stop you from following your hearts. With love, Mom." Margaret also said goodbye to her closest friends, explaining the situation. "You must think I'm crazy, don't you?" she said with a trembling smile. "No, Margaret." "We think you're brave," replied Anne, her best friend, holding her hand firmly. "Go find your love. We're here for you." During one of these visits, Margaret ran into an old friend, John, who had served in the war with Jack. He was surprised and emotional to hear about the letter. "I always believed Jack had something special, something that kept him strong. Now I know it was you, Margaret," he said, his eyes glistening with tears. John offered to help Margaret organize the trip, providing safe transportation and companionship. "I'll go with you. That way we can ensure you get there safely," he said, his voice full of determination. "I don't know how to thank you, John," Margaret said, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. "Your help means the world to me." Margaret also spoke with the detective Jack had hired. "He never gave up, you know," the detective said. "He hired me decades ago. With every lead, every false alarm, he kept hope alive." These words reinforced Margaret's resolve. "I need to see him, to tell him I never forgot him," she murmured to herself, her eyes shining with new resolve. The night before the departure, Margaret sat in the garden, looking at the stars. "Jack, I'm coming. I hope we can still find happiness together," she thought, feeling her heart race. She reviewed her suitcase one last time, making sure everything was in order. Every item was packed with care and love, as if preparing for a reunion with her destiny. "All set," she said, finally allowing herself a moment of calm. Margaret lay down in bed, trying to sleep. Her thoughts were filled with memories and hopes for the future. Tomorrow starts a new journey, she thought, before finally falling asleep, dreaming of the reunion she had longed for. Margaret and John embarked on the journey to the coastal town where Jack was staying. John had arranged for a comfortable and safe car, and his presence was a constant comfort to Margaret. The winding road stretched out before them as the landscape changed from green fields to the blue of the distant ocean. During the trip, Margaret couldn't contain her emotions. "John, I still can't believe Jack is alive. All these years thinking he had died." Her voice faltered, and she looked out the window, trying to control her tears. John, keeping his eyes on the road, replied in a reassuring tone, "I know, Margaret. This is a miracle, and we'll find out the truth together. He'll be so happy to see you." The silence that followed was comfortable, marked only by the soft hum of the engine and the wind passing through the open windows. Margaret used these moments to revisit precious memories. "Do you remember that picnic we all had before the war? Jack playing the guitar and singing for us? Those were such happy days." John smiled, remembering as well. "Yes, I remember it well. Jack always had a way of making everyone feel special. He had a generous soul." As the journey continued, Margaret began to reflect on the decisions she had made in life. Will Jack still remember me the same way? So many things have changed. I've changed. The doubt in her voice was palpable. "Margaret," John said, glancing at her briefly, "true love doesn't fade with time. You two share a bond that has survived decades. He will remember, and he will love you just as he always did." As they drove, the scenery began to change to the coast, and the salty smell of the sea filled the air. Margaret closed her eyes and took a deep breath, feeling a mix of peace and anxiety. "We're almost there," she thought, her heart beating faster. During a rest stop, Margaret and John sat in a roadside cafe. "John, thank you for being here with me. I don't know if I would have had the courage to do this alone." She held his hand, her eyes filled with gratitude. John squeezed her hand back. "I'll always be here for you, Margaret. We're family in a way, and I'm as eager as you are to see Jack again." Back in the car, the final stretch of the journey seemed endless. Margaret began to feel a mix of anxiety and hope growing inside her. "John, what if he doesn't recognize me? What if he's changed so much that we can't reconnect?" "Margaret, you have to believe that everything will be okay. You two have been through so much. This will be a new beginning, not an end," John said, trying to reassure her. When they finally arrived at the coastal town, the reality of the imminent reunion hit Margaret. They stopped in front of the hospital, an old but well-maintained building overlooking the sea. Margaret took a deep breath, trying to gather her courage. "We're here," John said softly. "Let's go, Margaret. Jack is waiting for you." Margaret stepped out of the car, her legs trembling. She looked at the hospital, a mix of fear and hope in her heart. "Wait for me, Jack," she thought, as she slowly walked toward the entrance, with John by her side, ready to support her every step of the way. Margaret and John entered the hospital, where the smell of disinfectant and the sound of hurried footsteps filled the air. Margaret's heart pounded as she followed John to the reception desk. "We're here to see Jack Thompson," John said to the receptionist, a young woman with a friendly face. The receptionist checked the system and smiled kindly. "Of course, he's in room 305. You can take the stairs or the elevator on the right." Margaret thanked her, feeling her hands sweat. They opted for the elevator, which ascended slowly, increasing her anxiety with each floor. When the doors opened on the third floor, Margaret almost couldn't move. John gently touched her shoulder, encouraging her to continue. They walked down the hallway until they reached room 305. Margaret took a deep breath before opening the door, feeling a mix of fear and anticipation. There was Jack lying in bed, his hair gray and his body weakened by time. His eyes, however, still held the same sparkle as before. "Jack," Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face. He slowly turned his head, and when he saw her, his eyes filled with recognition and emotion. "Margaret," he murmured, his voice weak but full of love. "You came." Margaret approached the bed and held his hand, feeling the warmth and familiarity. "I never stopped loving you, Jack," she said, sobbing. "I thought I'd lost you forever." Jack squeezed her hand with as much strength as he could muster. "I never stopped loving you either. Every day without you was a challenge. But now you're here. We can finally be together." John, sensing the intimate moment, discreetly stepped back, giving them privacy. Margaret and Jack spent the next few minutes in comforting silence, just feeling each other's presence. "There's so much I want to tell you, Margaret," Jack said, his eyes shining with tears. "But first, I need you to know how hard I fought to find you. Every letter, every detective, every lead, I never gave up." Margaret nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude. "And I never stopped thinking of you. All these years, you were my hope." A nurse entered the room, interrupting the moment. "Mr. Thompson, it's time for your medication," she said kindly, preparing the meds. "Margaret, can you help me?" Jack asked, and she promptly helped the nurse give him the medication. "Thank you, my dear," he said afterward, his voice still weak but full of love. When the nurse left, Margaret settled into a chair beside the bed. "Jack, we'll face this together. No matter what happens, I'm here with you." Jack smiled, a weak but genuine smile. "Having you here makes all the difference, Margaret. It gives me the strength to keep going." Over the next few days, Margaret and Jack spent hours talking, laughing, and reminiscing about the past. Jack showed her a box full of memories, photos, letters, and small objects he had kept over the years. Each item told a story, and each story reinforced the bond they still shared. "You are the reason I kept fighting," Jack said in a quiet moment. "These memories kept me alive." Margaret smiled, holding an old photo of the two of them. "And you are the reason I never gave up on love. Finally, we can build new memories together." Jack closed his eyes, a peaceful smile on his face. "Yes, Margaret, let's do that. Together until the end." And so, Margaret and Jack began to create a new chapter in their lives. A chapter full of love, hope, and the kind of happiness only a miraculous reunion can bring. Margaret and Jack spent the next few days immersed in deep conversations and tender moments. John, a friend of Jack's, although he only spent a few days with him before having to return to his town, also shared moments of joy with the two of them. Every day together was a gift, precious time they never imagined they would have again. They explored shared memories and told stories that had never been told before. One afternoon, as the couple gazed at the sea from Jack's room window, he said, "Remember when we promised to travel the world? I still want to do that with you, Margaret, at least in our memories." Margaret smiled, holding his hand. "We can start now, Jack. Close your eyes and tell me where we're going first." Jack closed his eyes and began to describe a scene in Italy, where they had always dreamed of visiting. "We're in a small village in Tuscany. The sun is setting and the vineyards are bathed in golden light. We can hear the sound of soft music coming from a festival in the main square." Margaret followed the description, adding details. "We're sitting at a small cafe table, savoring local wine. The aroma of fresh Italian food fills the air, and we're surrounded by laughter and joy." These imaginary trips brought deep comfort to both of them, allowing them to escape, even if just for brief moments, from the hospital walls. Their conversations took them to distant places, and also made them face regrets and unsaid apologies. "Margaret," Jack began one evening, "I'm sorry I couldn't find you sooner. So many letters sent and never answered. I should have tried even harder." Margaret caressed Jack's face, her eyes full of understanding. "There's nothing to forgive, Jack. What matters is that we're together now. The time we lost only makes this moment more precious." One afternoon, John brought a special surprise, a photo album from the time Jack and Margaret were together. "I thought this might bring back some good memories," he said, handing the album to Margaret. She opened the album and began flipping through the pages, each photo bringing a wave of emotions. "Look at this one, Jack. It was our first dance together. You were so nervous." Jack laughed, a weak but joyful sound. "Yes, I almost stepped on your foot about 10 times. But you looked beautiful in that blue dress. It was a magical night." As they looked at the photos, Margaret felt a sense of peace. "These are the memories that brought us here, Jack, and now we're making new ones, even in the midst of all this." During these days, Jack's health had its ups and downs. There were moments of pain and fatigue, but also moments of laughter and tenderness. Margaret was by his side, offering comfort and unconditional love. One night, Jack asked Margaret to open a drawer in the nightstand. Inside was a small wooden box. "This is for you," he said, his voice soft. "Open it." Margaret opened the box and found a silver ring with a small diamond. "Jack, it's beautiful. Where did you get this?" "I bought it many years ago, hoping that one day I could give it to you," Jack replied. "I wanted you to know how much you mean to me." Margaret, with tears in her eyes, put the ring on her finger. "Jack, I'll never take this ring off. It's a symbol of our eternal love." From that moment on, Margaret felt a new strength within her. They began to plan small events in the hospital, an improvised candlelit dinner, afternoons listening to old music, and even a small symbolic ceremony to renew their vows of love. "Let's celebrate each day, Jack," Margaret said, holding his hand. "Every moment we have together is a gift." Jack's health began to deteriorate rapidly. Each day that passed, he grew weaker, and Margaret knew that their time together was coming to an end. However, she refused to give in to despair. Instead, she focused on making every moment count. One morning, as she helped Jack with his breakfast, he looked at her with an expression that mixed gratitude and sadness. "Margaret, I don't want you to suffer. I want you to live the years you have left with joy." Margaret held his hand tightly, tears threatening to fall. "Jack, all these years I lived with the hope of finding you. Now that we're together, I can't think of anything else but being by your side." Jack smiled weakly. "And you are, my love. You are. But you have to promise me that you'll keep living fully, even after I'm gone." She nodded, unable to speak, and leaned down to gently kiss his forehead. "I promise, Jack. I promise to live for both of us." The following days were filled with deep conversations and comfortable silences. Jack took the opportunity to share more stories of the time they spent apart, his struggles and small victories. Margaret, in turn, talked about the children, the grandchildren, and how she had always kept Jack's memory alive in her heart. One afternoon, as the sun was setting, Jack asked Margaret to open the window. "I want to feel the sea breeze one last time," he said, his voice weak but determined. Margaret opened the window, letting the salty air fill the room. She sat beside Jack, holding his hand. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yes, it is," he replied, closing his eyes and breathing deeply. "Do you remember that summer we camped on the beach? The stars seemed so close we could touch them." Margaret smiled, remembering that magical moment. "It was one of the happiest nights of my life, Jack, and I still feel that way when I'm with you." That night, Jack had an intense episode of pain. The nurse quickly entered to administer medication, and Margaret held his hand, whispering words of comfort. "I'm here, Jack, I'm here." When the pain subsided, Jack seemed exhausted but serene. He looked at Margaret with an intensity that made her shiver. "Thank you for being here. You've given me peace, Margaret, more than you can imagine." In Jack's final moments, Margaret stayed by his side, holding his hand and softly singing the song he used to play on the guitar. always in my heart, she whispered, feeling his presence as strong as ever. When Jack took his last breath, Margaret felt a deep sadness mixed with a comforting peace. He was at peace, and she knew he would always be with her. The medical team entered quietly, allowing Margaret a moment alone to say goodbye. She kissed Jack's forehead, whispering, "Until we meet again, my love. Until we meet again." In the days that followed, Margaret felt Jack's absence like an open wound, but she also found strength in the memories they had created together. She knew she would live each day in honor of the love they shared, a love that transcended time and space. And so, Margaret began to take the first steps toward fulfilling the promise she made to Jack, to live fully, with love and hope in her heart. After Jack's death, Margaret returned to her home in Seabrook, feeling like an empty shell. Jack's absence was a constant weight, but along with the sadness, there was a sense of peace. She knew he was no longer suffering, and that their love continued to live in her heart. In the first days after her return, Margaret spent hours in the garden, tending to the flowers she and Jack had loved so much. The garden was a refuge, a place where she could feel his presence. "Each flower is a reminder of our love," she thought, as she lovingly cared for the plants. Her children, concerned for her well-being, visited her frequently. During one of these visits, David and Sarah sat with Margaret on the porch. "Mom, we know it's been hard, but we want you to know that we're here for you," David said, holding her hand. "You've been amazing," Margaret replied with a sad smile, "but I feel like I need to find a way to honor Jack's memory. He wanted me to live fully." It was then that Margaret found a letter among Jack's belongings. It was a will, handwritten, leaving his entire inheritance to her. "Use this to find happiness and help others find it too," the letter said. She was in shock, tears rolling down her face. He wanted to make sure she was financially secure. She contacted the lawyer, and within weeks, she had a fortune in her account. Inspired by Jack's words, Margaret decided to use the inheritance to create something meaningful. "I want to start a foundation in Jack's name," she announced to her children. "A foundation that helps people find peace and reconciliation, just as Jack and I did." Sarah looked at her mother with admiration. "That's wonderful, Mom. I'm sure Jack would be very proud." In the following months, Margaret dedicated herself to creating the foundation. She organized community events, met with local leaders, and actively promoted the cause. "Every person we help is a tribute to Jack's love," she would say in her speeches, moving everyone who heard her. One of the first events organized by the foundation was a community gathering where Margaret shared her story. "I know many of you carry pains from the past," she began, "but I want you to know that it's possible to find peace and happiness again." The event was a success. People of all ages shared their own stories of love, loss, and reconciliation. Margaret felt a wave of hope as she saw how her and Jack's story inspired others. Among the many people who approached Margaret was a young woman named Emily, who was going through a difficult time in her relationship. "Your story gave me the courage to fight for the love of my life," Emily said, her eyes shining with hope. Thank you, Margaret." Those words touched Margaret deeply. This is Jack's true legacy, she thought, a legacy of love and hope. As the foundation grew, Margaret found a new purpose in her life. She traveled to different cities, sharing her story and promoting the message of reconciliation and love. In each place she visited, she found new stories, new lives transformed by the power of love. Back in Seabrook, Margaret's home became a gathering place for people seeking advice and comfort. She welcomed everyone with a warm smile, offering tea and a listening ear. "We all need a place where we can feel loved and accepted," she would say. Margaret also began writing a book about her journey with Jack. "I want the world to know about the love we shared and how it changed our lives," she explained to her children. "This book will be my gift to future generations." In moments of solitude, Margaret still felt Jack's presence. She knew he was with her, guiding her and giving her strength to continue. "You brought me peace, Jack. Now it's my turn to bring that peace to the world," she would whisper to the wind. And so, Margaret lived each day with a renewed purpose, honoring Jack's memory and spreading the message of love and reconciliation. Her heart, though marked by loss, was filled with hope and determination. Margaret decided that Jack's inheritance would not only be a way to remember the past, but also a bridge to new adventures and opportunities for growth. With the support of her children, she began planning a series of trips, but this time with a renewed purpose, to find and help others who, like her, sought reconciliation and new beginnings. Her first stop was in the charming town of Bruges, Belgium. There, Margaret got involved with a small art school that offered free classes to children from low-income families. "Art is a powerful way to express emotions and heal wounds," she told the teachers, as she made a generous donation to the program. During her stay, Margaret befriended a young teacher named Sophie. Sophie was struggling to overcome the recent loss of her mother and was deeply inspired by Margaret's story. "You've given me hope that it's possible to find peace even after great losses," Sophie said, emotional. Back in the United States, Margaret was invited to speak at a conference on active aging and purpose in life. In her speech, she shared the lessons she had learned during her travels and the lasting impact of Jack's love. "Aging doesn't mean stopping living. We can find new purposes and continue to grow," she affirmed, receiving warm applause. Margaret also decided to explore an old hobby she had always wanted to develop: photography. She bought a professional camera and began documenting her travels and the stories of the people she met. "Each picture captures a moment of transformation and hope," she said, as she organized a photo exhibition that toured several cities. During a visit to Japan, Margaret was captivated by the serenity of Zen gardens and the philosophy of living in the present. She spent a month in Kyoto, learning about the culture and finding inner peace. During a tea ceremony, she met Haruki, a Zen master who helped her deepen her understanding of grief and acceptance. "Tranquility lies in accepting the impermanence of life," he taught her. Upon returning to Seabrook, Margaret began organizing community outings, taking groups of seniors and young people to explore nature and learn about photography. "I want everyone to see the world through a new lens," she would say, as the participants marveled at the landscapes and found new interests. An unexpected event brought an exciting twist. Margaret received a letter from a film production company interested in turning her story into a movie. "Your journey is inspiring, and we want to share it with a larger audience," the letter said. After some consideration, Margaret agreed, seeing it as yet another way to honor Jack's memory. During the film's production, Margaret had the opportunity to travel to Hollywood and meet the cast and crew. She was impressed by everyone's dedication to telling her story with authenticity and sensitivity. "It's like reliving my life, but with the chance to inspire millions," she reflected, moved. Margaret's children, observing the transformations in their mother's life, felt proud and inspired. "Mom, you're an example of strength and resilience," Sarah said. "You've shown us that it's never too late to find happiness and make a difference." David agreed, hugging his mother tenderly. "Jack's legacy lives on in every act of kindness you do. We're so proud of you." Margaret knew that her time would come one day too, but until then, she would continue to live fully, keeping the promise she made to Jack, to live each day with love and joy. And when that day came, she would be ready, knowing that she had fulfilled her legacy of love.